Today, the video game industry is a global juggernaut. It generates over $180 billion a year. It dwarfs the global box office and the music industry combined. It is a fundamental pillar of modern entertainment. But there was a time, not that long ago, when the entire concept of a video game was widely considered a passing fad, a gimmick, a piece of electronic plastic that was destined to sit in the attic next to the pet rock. And then came Atari. Atari didn't just participate in the video game market. They essentially invented it out of thin air. They took obscure, highly technical computer programming and turned it into the most explosive consumer product of the 20th century. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Atari was the fastest growing company in the history of the United States. They held an absolute, undisputed monopoly over the living room. Playing Atari became synonymous with playing video games. But their rise to total global dominance is only half the story, because what Atari is truly remembered for isn't just creating the video game industry, it's for almost single-handedly destroying it forever. In a matter of months, a multi-billion-dollar empire collapsed into dust. It was a disaster so catastrophic that the company was forced to literally bury its failures in a New Mexico desert. So how did a company with a total monopoly manage to lose billions of dollars and nosedive into bankruptcy? This is the story of unmatched innovation, corporate greed, unimaginable hubris, and the dramatic rise and fall of Atari. To understand how Atari conquered the world, we have to go back to 1971. A charismatic engineering student named Nolan Bushnell, along with his friend Ted Dabney, realized something massive. At the time, computers were million-dollar machines, the size of refrigerators, locked away in university laboratories. Bushnell believed that if he could shrink this technology down and attach it to a coin-operated mechanism, people would pay to play with it. They founded a company and named it Atari, a term from the Japanese board game Go, roughly translating to hitting the target or check. Their first hire was an engineer named Al Alcorn. To test Al's programming skills, Bushnell gave him a simple assignment: create a basic electronic table tennis game, 2 paddles, a square ball, and a dotted line down the middle. It was just a warm-up exercise. But what Alcorn created was magic. He added sound, a simple electronic boop. He made the ball speed up the longer a volley lasted. It was fiercely competitive and incredibly addictive. They called it Pong. In 1972, Bushnell and Alcorn took a prototype of Pong, housed in a bright yellow wooden arcade cabinet, and placed it in a local tavern in Sunnyvale, California, called Andy Capp's. A few days later, the tavern owner called Bushnell with a problem. The machine was broken. When Alcorn went to fix it, he discovered that the machine hadn't suffered a technical failure. The coin mechanism was literally jammed with quarters. The game was so incredibly popular that it had overflowed with money in a matter of days. Atari had struck gold. They began mass-producing Pong cabinets, selling them for roughly $1,000 a piece. Arcades, bars, and bowling alleys couldn't get them fast enough. Atari went from a garage startup to a multi-million-dollar enterprise virtually overnight. But Bushnell knew that the arcade market had a ceiling. If Atari really wanted to become an empire, they couldn't just rely on people dropping quarters in a bar. They needed to get inside the home. They needed to invade the living room. In the mid-1970s, home consoles existed, but they were incredibly limited. They were dedicated consoles, meaning the circuitry inside was hardwired to play just one game. If you bought a home version of Pong, that piece of plastic would only ever play Pong. Atari's engineers were working on a revolutionary concept codenamed Stella. Instead of hardwiring the game into the console would just be a blank brain, a microprocessor. The games themselves would be stored on read-only memory chips housed inside plastic cartridges. You buy the console once, and you can buy endless cartridges to play completely different games. It was a brilliant razor and blades business model. But there was a major catch. Developing this new console, which would become the Atari video computer system, or the Atari 2600, required immense capital. Microprocessors were cutting-edge technology and aggressively expensive. Bushnell needed cash, and a lot of it, to finish manufacturing before a competitor beat them to the punch. So, in 1976, Nolan Bushnell made a fateful decision. He sold Atari to the media conglomerate Warner Communications for $28 million. At first, it seemed like a perfect marriage. Warner had the deep pockets necessary to mass-produce the Atari 2600, which launched in the fall of 1977. But almost immediately, a massive culture clash erupted. Atari, under Bushnell, was a chaotic, free-spirited counterculture hub. Engineers walked around barefoot, smoked weed in the office, and held meetings in hot tubs. They were brilliant, eccentric inventors. Warner Communications, on the other hand, was run by corporate suits from New York. They cared about spreadsheets, quarterly earnings, and efficiency. By 1978, the tension boiled over. Nolan Bushnell was forced out of the very company he founded. Warner installed a new CEO, a former textile executive named Ray Kassar. Ray Kassar famously hated video games. He didn't understand the product, and he didn't respect the engineers who made it. He viewed the programmers the same way he viewed factory line workers, easily replaceable cogs in a machine. This toxic corporate mindset would eventually become the cancer that destroyed the company. But in the short term, Kassar's aggressive, hyper-commercialized strategy was about to make Atari the most profitable company on Earth. Under Ray Kassar, Atari shifted from a hardware company to a software powerhouse. The real turning point came in 1980, when Atari secured the exclusive home console rights to the absolute hottest arcade game on the planet, Space Invaders. When Space Invaders launched on the Atari 2600, it triggered a consumer frenzy. People were buying the $200 console just so they could play this one specific game. Sales quadrupled. By 1982, Atari was pulling in over $2 billion in annual revenue. They accounted for a staggering 70% of Warner Communications' total operating profit. They were printing money, but beneath the roaring financial success, a mutiny was brewing. Remember how Ray Kassar treated his programmers like assembly line workers? Well, the engineers at Atari were realizing a very uncomfortable truth. A single programmer would spend months designing, coding, and perfecting a blockbuster game that would go on to generate tens of millions of dollars for Atari. In return, that programmer received an average salary of around $25,000 a year. No royalties, no bonuses. Atari wouldn't even allow the programmers to put their names on the game boxes, fearing that if the programmers became famous, they would demand more money or be poached by rival companies. 4 of Atari's best programmers, David Crane, Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller, and Bob Whitehead, had finally had enough. They had programmed games that accounted for a massive percentage of Atari's total revenue, and they demanded a tiny cut of the profits. Ray Kassar looked them in the eye and famously told them, "You are no more important to that game than the guy on the assembly line who puts it together." So, the 4 programmers quit. They formed their own company in 1979 specifically to design games for the Atari 2600, but they would own the software and put their names right on the box. They called their new company Activision. Atari furiously sued them to stop them from making games for the 2600, claiming they held a monopoly on their own hardware. But Atari lost the lawsuit. This court ruling completely changed the industry. It legally birthed the concept of third-party developers. Suddenly, anyone could legally manufacture and sell cartridges for the Atari 2600. And while this seemed like a win for creative freedom, it accidentally set the stage for the most devastating financial crash in entertainment history. By 1982, Atari was blinded by their own success. They believed the public would buy absolutely anything they put out, simply because it had the Atari logo on it. Atari secured the home rights to Pac-Man, the most famous arcade game in history. But instead of giving their programmers time to build a good version, management demanded the game be rushed out in a matter of weeks to hit the holiday season. The resulting port was an unmitigated disaster. The graphics flickered horribly, the colors were washed out, and the sound effects were an irritating screech. It barely resembled the arcade classic. Even worse, Atari produced 12 million copies of Pac-Man, even though they had only sold 10 million consoles at the time. They literally banked on the assumption that millions of people would buy the console just for the game. Millions did buy it, but millions also returned it in absolute disgust. Consumer trust began to fracture. But Atari didn't learn their lesson. Later that same year, Warner Communications paid an astronomical $21 million for the video game rights to Steven Spielberg's blockbuster film E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Because the licensing deal took so long to negotiate, the solitary programmer assigned to the game, Howard Scott Warshaw, was given a truly impossible deadline. He had just 6 weeks to design, code, and finalize the entire game from scratch so the cartridges could be manufactured in time for Christmas. E.T. for the Atari 2600 was famously broken. Players spent the entire game falling into inescapable green pits, completely unsure of what they were supposed to be doing. It was frustrating, confusing, and completely unplayable. But the terrible games produced by Atari were only a fraction of the problem. Because of the Activision lawsuit, third-party developers were now flooding the market. But they weren't all brilliant engineers like the Activision founders. Suddenly, every company on Earth, from Purina dog food to Quaker Oats, was hiring amateur programmers to churn out literal digital garbage just to cash in on the video game craze. The market was suddenly drowning in hundreds of terrible, low-quality games. There was no internet to check reviews. Parents were spending $40 on a cartridge, taking it home and realizing it was completely broken. The video game market didn't just stumble, it flatlined. In 1983, the video game industry experienced a localized depression of epic proportions. Retailers, suddenly stuck with millions of unsold, terrible video games, began desperately slashing prices. Games that cost $40 a few months prior were sitting in the bargain bin for $4. Toy stores literally refused to carry video games anymore. They viewed them as toxic assets. Atari, sitting on mountains of unsold inventory from Pac-Man, E.T., and dozens of other failures, began hemorrhaging money at an unimaginable rate. In 1983 alone, Atari lost a staggering $536 million. In today's money, that is well over $1.5 billion, wiped out in a single year. They were bleeding cash so fast that Warner Communications panicked. In a desperate bid to hide their failure and avoid tax penalties on unsold inventory, Atari loaded 14 semi-trucks with millions of unsold game cartridges, drove them to a remote landfill in Alamogordo, New Mexico, and literally buried them under concrete. It became an urban legend for decades until it was finally excavated in 2014, proving the sheer scale of their desperation. The crash completely devastated Atari. Warner Communications couldn't sustain the losses. In 1984, they broke Atari apart and sold off the pieces. The home console division was sold to Jack Tramiel, the aggressive founder of Commodore Computers, who gutted the staff, fired thousands of employees, and essentially tried to pivot Atari into selling cheap personal computers. Atari, the undisputed king of the living room, was dead. The media widely reported that the video game fad was officially over. It was a spectacular, multi-billion-dollar implosion brought on by corporate arrogance and zero quality control. As Atari burned to the ground in the United States, a company over in Japan was quietly taking notes. Nintendo watched the American video game crash of 1983 very carefully. When they brought their own console, the Famicom, to America in 1985, they rebranded it entirely. They didn't call it a video game console. They called it an entertainment system. To get past the traumatized toy retailers, they bundled it with a plastic robot named Rob and a light gun, marketing it as a high-tech toy rather than a video game machine. More importantly, Nintendo completely solved Atari's fatal flaw. They implemented a hardware lockout chip inside the NES. No third-party developer could make a game for the Nintendo unless they agreed to strict quality control standards, and Nintendo manufactured the cartridges themselves. They even slapped a golden seal of quality on every box to win back the trust of the consumer. Nintendo single-handedly resurrected the video game industry from the grave that Atari had dug. Over the next few decades, the Atari brand became a hollow shell. It was passed around from holding company to holding company. It released a few failed consoles in the 90s, like the Atari Jaguar, but it never regained even a fraction of its former glory. Today, the brand exists primarily to license its retro logo for t-shirts, cryptocurrency ventures, and weird concepts like Atari-themed resort hotels. But the legacy of the original Atari cannot be overstated. Atari proved that interactive digital entertainment was a viable, explosive business model. They established the concept of third-party developers, which is the economic foundation of modern giants like PlayStation, Xbox, and Steam. And perhaps most importantly, their spectacular failure served as a permanent multi-billion-dollar warning to the entire tech industry. A monopoly is never safe if you stop respecting the consumer. The story of Atari is one of the wildest boom and bust cycles in modern business history. They created an industry from scratch, conquered the world, and then completely suffocated on their own greed in less than a decade. If you found this deep dive into the chaotic history of Atari interesting, please do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps us keep producing these business documentaries for you. Would you ever want to see Atari make a real comeback in the modern gaming space? Or should they stay in the history books? Let me know in the comments. Click the video on your screen right now to see another massive corporate rise and fall, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.